We will move directly to the speaker session of the 11th International Greenhouse Gas Conference. Let me invite our first speaker, Mr. Stefano di Clara, International Policy Director of the International Emissions Trading Association. He will give us a presentation on the Article 6 negotiations. Mr. de Clara, please. The next 20 minutes are all yours.
I hope you can hear me okay and you can see my screen. Well, first of all, it's an honor to be here, and thank you again for the invite to provide this first presentation in the context of prospects for carbon markets in 2030, and more specifically, I'll provide a quick update on where we are with the Article 6 negotiations. Now, I'm also hoping to be able to convey the importance of these negotiations for carbon markets today, but especially for carbon markets in the next decade. So before I get started, just a quick word about IETA, the organization I work for. We are an international business association that brings together businesses from a wide range of different sectors in support for carbon markets as a way to put a price on CO2 emissions and as a way to reduce those emissions. So we are actively engaged in supporting domestic carbon markets around the world, and of course, we also give a lot of attention to international carbon markets, and that is the other reason why we spend a lot of time and effort working on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. In the slide here, you can see some of our members. We have around 130 members from a wide range of different sectors and a wide range of different countries. So starting from a bit of the basics, and just to give a bit of context on what actually is Article 6, it's obviously a part of the Paris Agreement that was drafted and adopted at COP21 in 2015 in Paris. And if you have a closer look at the agreement, you will see that it is organized around key building blocks in different articles. So, for example, you have an article that talks about the long-term goal of the agreement. You have another article that talks about how the nationally determined contributions have to be designed and accounted for, and so on and so forth. So you have an article for each key topic and building block of the agreement. And among these articles, you have Article 6, which talks about voluntary cooperation in the achievement of the national targets. So in a way, it does introduce a market framework in the Paris Agreement. If we zoom a bit more specifically on Article 6, we'll see that it has three main building blocks. Under Article 6.2, you have provisions that tell countries how to account for any transfer in mitigation outcomes that might result from cooperation in the achievement of national targets, or from any international cooperation on mitigation action. So Article 6.2 effectively allows countries to get together and cooperate in mitigation action, and it also tells them how to account for that joint action and for any transfer that might happen between two countries under the Paris Agreement. Then you have Article 6.4 that aims at establishing a new centralized mechanism to facilitate climate action and emission reduction projects. So in a way, this will be a mechanism that operates in a similar way as the CDM and the JI did for the Kyoto Protocol. There are a lot of similarities, but also there are some key differences here. But I think the CDM is a good reference for what the the Article 6.4 mechanism might do one day. And then under Article 6.8, you have the establishment of a work program for known market approaches. So for forms of corporations that don't take the form of an international market. So this might seem a bit remote or a bit undefined, but actually Article 6 has a really great potential to contribute to the overall goals of the Paris Agreement. So first of all, as I said, it effectively allows countries to get together and cooperate on the achievement of the national targets, which is a key feature of Article 6. By doing so, it could establish an international framework for example, the linkage of different carbon pricing policies. So, for example, it could be a framework to link two emission trading systems or two carbon markets, and it will allow to effectively count that link towards the Paris targets. It could also facilitate the creation of carbon clubs, and by carbon clubs we mean a group of countries that get together and cooperate on the achievement of their national targets, and effectively by introducing these market dynamics to the way that the Paris targets are met. It can reduce the overall cost of meeting those targets, and at the same time, it could allow for more ambition to be put on the table, and also effectively by representing a framework that can connect leftover emission sources to sinks of emissions. It can also be an enabler to the achievement of net zero emissions, which is the ultimate goal of the Paris Agreement, as cost effectively and as quickly as possible. In terms of who will be the actual users of Article 6, you have a multitude of possibilities. Of course, parties can use Article 6 for their target. It can also be a key facilitator and catalyzer of voluntary action by the private sector. It can be something that international funds use to channel climate finance. It can be a key component to emission trading systems and to domestic carbon pricing policies. And I think some of the following presentations will delve into that to some extent. And there are also interactions with other international frameworks and international policies, such as CORSIA, the international system to reduce emissions in the aviation sector. And there are obvious interlinkages between the two systems. So Article 6 can be effectively a key enabler of climate action, also in this case, outside of the Paris Agreement. If we look at the current outlook for domestic policies, we can see that emission trading systems and carbon taxes are on the rise in more and more jurisdictions. So these are obvious candidates that tomorrow might look at the use of Article 6. Some of these countries already use international linkages and international credits, which after 2020 will fall under the umbrella of Article 6. There are also countries that stated in their Paris commitment that they intend to use Article 6, or they might use Article 6. Those are the countries in green on this map, which is based on the previous round of NDCs. As you might know, new NDCs are expected before COP26. So we will see in the next round of NDCs how many countries will reference the use of Article 6 or international markets. And then again, if you look at what's happening in the real world, there are some form of Article 6 implementation of Article 6 pilots that are already ongoing, and they're already being implemented in this map. is from an excellent study that provides a bit of an overview on what is happening already, even before 2021, so even before the actual start of the first NDC cycle under the Paris Agreement. We've also done, together with the University of Maryland, a bit of modeling and a bit of a study on the actual potential of Article 6 and the preliminary potential and the preliminary results are showing that it can have, if it's fully implemented to the maximum extent, it can have a significant contribution to the goals of the Paris Agreement. So first of all, it could reduce significantly the cost of meeting the Paris targets. And by doing that, it can effectively generate and free more resources that can be invested towards additional mitigation and additional ambition. So it has the potential of contributing to both the environmental objective of the Paris Agreement and the climate objective, but also it can reduce the cost of meeting those objectives. But all of this is purely on paper for the time being, except for those piloting examples that we just talked about. And it is purely on paper because the rules for the implementation of Article 6 are still being drafted. The first attempt at developing rules for Article 6 happened at COP24 back a couple of years ago in 2018 in Katowice, which adopted the so-called Paris Rulebook, which is the compilation of implementing details and rules for most of the articles. But because of fundamental differences in opinion between different countries and because of certain problems in the Article 6 negotiations that couldn't be solved, Article 6 was left out from the Paris Rulebook, and effectively its adoption was deferred to COP25, which took place the following year in Madrid. So this means in December of last year. Again, COP25 made some progress on different topics. We got really, really close to the adoption of rules for Article 6. As we will see in a second, there were just a couple of key issues that were still open. Everything else was resolved, and the countries were almost ready to adopt a final rule set for Article 6. But again, some key differences couldn't be resolved, and then again, the adoption of Article 6 rules was postponed again and deferred to COP26. This is starting to be really technical and detailed, but just to give you a perspective on what are the key differences. Most of the key issues and sticking points that couldn't be resolved at COP24 and 25 have to do with accounting. So, for example, for how you account for transfers from inside and outside of the NDC, accounting for what is called a non-NDC use of ITMO. So, for this speaks to CORSIA, as we talked about earlier. There are key differences on single-year versus multi-year targets, and more in general, how and when you implement corresponding adjustments, which are a key feature of Article 6. These differences in opinion and in position on accounting really have to do with different interpretations that different countries have about the role and the purpose of Article 6. And so more work on these issues will have to be done before and at COP26 if we want to get to the adoption of an Article 6 rule set at the next COP. Then again, a really contentious negotiating issue is the transition of the Kyoto Protocol mechanism. As I mentioned earlier, there are market mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol, most importantly the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, and there is discussion on what should happen to existing projects under the CDM, and also what should happen to existing credits that are generated by the CDM. And so there is discussion on whether these should be transitioned into the framework of the Paris Agreement and the framework of Article 6, or whether they should be basically terminated, and whether we should start from scratch with the Paris Agreement and with Article 6. And then two really contentious points are the additional proceeds and something called overall mitigation of in global emissions. They might seem like technicalities, but they're actually really significant points because they have deep implications for climate finance and adaptation finance on one front, and they also have implications for ambition on the other front. So these are two issues that are central in the Article 6 negotiations. But everything else is more or less aligned or resolved. We only have these 3 or 4 key issues that are really still outstanding, and these are the things that will have to be worked out at COP26 if we want to adopt a rule set for Article 6. I'll spend the last couple of slides talking a little bit about what's the way forward from here and what we might expect in the next few months. So as I said, the adoption of Article 6 rules is still pending and has been deferred to COP26, which was meant to take place in November this year, but due to the COVID pandemic, has been postponed to November 2021. So work on Article 6 will continue throughout 2020 and throughout 2021, and is expected to conclude at COP25. At COP26, which will take place next year. Even though we don't have rules for Article 6 at the moment, as we saw, Article 6 pilots and the implementation of Article 6 is already happening. This is because international cooperation and cooperative approaches under the Paris Agreement can go ahead and can happen even in the absence of Article 6 rules. Having rules for Article 6 would make a lot of things easier, but does not prevent, their absence does not prevent those pilots and those Article 6 approaches from happening. And some parties in Madrid stated that they will use the latest Article 6 draft documents as a guidance to undertake those cooperative approaches. And in terms of the way forward, it's fair to expect most of the progress to happen at COP26 as opposed to the lead up. This is because most of, if not all of the key issues that have to be resolved are highly political in nature, and so they require a political process to sort them out, and that process can only take place at COP26. All the previews and intersessional meetings and the negotiations are helpful to sort out the technicalities, but they're not able to deal with the political issues. And it's also important to underline that COP26 will be one major milestone in international diplomacy. It's probably the most important COP after COP21, which adopted the agreement, and COP24, which delivered the Paris rulebook. It's important because it will effectively mark the start of the Paris era. It's important also because it is expected to complete a lot of work that is ongoing to operationalize different aspects of the agreement, including rules for Article 6. It's important because it is the COP when parties are expected to communicate and revise their NDCs. So we're expecting to see more ambition to be put on the table, and knowing how important the next decade will be for climate action, the NDCs that will be presented at COP26 will be really, really important. And given how much political issues are at stake, it will require a really big diplomatic effort and a lot of preparatory work for it to be successful. And this is probably one of the key reasons behind the postponement of COP26. It wouldn't have been possible to deliver a successful COP given the current pandemic. So from that point of view, it's a good thing that it's been postponed by a year and parties have more time to prepare for it. And as I mentioned, we expect to see new NDCs at COP26. Parties are also expected to submit the long-term strategies together with the NDCs. We will hopefully have rules for Article 6. COP26 is also expected to adopt other key parts of the operationalization of the Paris Agreement, and it's also expected to mark the start of the discussion on the post-2025 financing goal. And this is just to say that Article 6 will not be the only key issue outstanding, and there's a lot at stake at the next COP. So it's definitely a space to watch for international markets, but for much more as well. And I'll stop it here for the time being, and I'm looking forward to the discussion later on. I hope that was clear, and I'm happy to take any question you might have later. Will, back to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. De Clara, for your very insightful presentation, which provided us with a detailed look at the potential, the current state, and roadblocks facing the Article 6 negotiations. With our newfound understanding of the broader carbon market mechanism, now let us look at the international carbon market specifically. Our second speaker is Mr. Alistair Ricci, Director of Asia Pacific Sustainability at the Asia Society Policy Institute. He will deliver his presentation on the prospects for international carbon market. Mr. Ritchie, please. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I'm honoured to be speaking at this very interesting and important event, and thank you to GIR for inviting me to speak. In my talk, I'll be sharing some insights on international carbon markets and how they could evolve under the Paris Agreement by 2030. So I'll start off by talking about the Paris Agreement itself, building on what Stefano de Clara introduced, and talking about its influence on international carbon markets. I'll then move on to talk about some wider influences on the carbon markets, and then present an overview of the current status and some indications of trends that are going on in the global carbon markets, and then finish off with some key policy considerations and challenges. So starting with the Paris Agreement and its influence on carbon markets, the first point I'd like to make is about ambition levels. So it's widely recognised that there's a need to ramp up ambition and to urgently do that. So under the current commitments, under the current NDCs, the forecast is for a global temperature increase of more than 3.2%, 3.2 degrees centigrade rather. That's more than double the aspirational target of 1.5 degrees C. We're hearing about more jurisdictions signing up to net zero emissions by 2050. And when that's put into stark focus about what that means by 2030, it means ambition needs to be ramped up. This is already recognized by the European Union, for example, that I'll be talking about shortly. As Stefano mentioned, the carbon pricing policies feature in many of the NDCs. In fact, approximately 100 of NDCs have reference to carbon markets and domestic carbon pricing. There's a broad range of policy options. There are policies that have explicit carbon prices, such as emissions trading systems, which I'll focus on in this talk, and carbon taxes. And there are also mechanisms that have implicit carbon prices, things like standards and mandates. So an example of that is things like renewable energy mandates, which have been very successful, but the problem with implicit carbon prices is they may not be cost effective. In terms of the drivers for emissions trading systems under the Paris Agreement, carbon budget-based NDCs, particularly where targets are broken down at the sectoral level, align themselves very well with ETS cap setting. So for example, with the Korean emissions trading system, the cap setting aligns itself very well to Korea's NDC. So it's a very positive, a very compatible tool for implementing an NDC. Linked emissions trading systems would facilitate the inflow and outflow of carbon units in NDCs, which is required for international transactions under Article 6. So this is expected to be quite a driver for the wider uptake of emissions trading systems. And most fundamentally, as the ambition levels need to ramp up, emissions trading systems enable lower cost and or more ambitious reduction targets. More broadly, in terms of economic drivers, the design of carbon pricing policies needs to be compatible with the economic development and growth of the relevant jurisdictions. So for example, under China's national ETS, their approach is for a more flexible tradable performance standard approach with a rate-based reduction targets, which gives them a bit more flexibility. And this might be more appropriate for developing countries with high levels of growth. In time, they may evolve to a mass-based approach, the more familiar cap and trade type system. The next point on economics is about carbon leakage. So every jurisdiction will want to protect its industry from carbon leakage. And I think we're going to see more evolution in carbon leakage protection measures. Indication is in the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which I'll pick up later. In terms of the energy and industry transition, I think all jurisdictions are facing an energy transition, and the reality of lower and lower cost renewables and the reality of coal phase out is important to factor into carbon pricing policy, particularly into cap setting modelling. So effectively, this means that GHG mitigation policy becomes cheaper, and it means that the carbon price signal can become stronger at the same cost. And then a key point is about industry. So industry will need to radically decarbonize its processes with some very expensive, innovative processes such as hydrogen steel making, and carbon pricing policies can play their role in enabling this. So for example, the EU's Innovation Fund is an important policy to support the EU's industry in uptaking radical decarbonisation, and it's also a way of getting more industry support for carbon pricing policies. I'll move now into a brief overview across different global regions of carbon markets. So starting with Europe. So the EU ETS Phase 4 design, which will run from 2021 to 2030, has been developed and published. But even now, it's already recognised as not ambitious enough. So the European Green Deal that was announced and it's embodied into legislation has a net zero emissions by 2050 target. So it's already recognised that the EU needs to ramp up its ambition of reductions by to 2030 from 40%, which is the current target, to over 50%. And this is going to result in a corresponding tightening in the ambition of the EU ETS cap setting. Currently, EU ETS aims to achieve a 43% reduction in GHG by 2030 from a 2005 baseline, this is going to have to increase to, say, over 50%. So what we're going to see is next year the EU will announce its new proposal to revise EU ETS Phase 4, and the linear reduction factor that we saw increased from 1.74% in Phase 3 to 2.2% in Phase 4 could increase to between 3 and 4% in the revised Phase 4 design. So this is very significant. The other point from the EU perspective is this carbon border adjustment mechanism. In line with the higher level of ambition, EU wants to protect its industry and it wants to ensure the price of imports more accurately reflects the carbon content. So this is a carbon leakage mitigation measure. If this is implemented, it might replace free allocation to the EU ETS installations, a proposal expected in 2021. And this will be applied unless partner countries have the same ambition under the Paris Agreement, unless they have similar carbon pricing systems in place. So I think that this could be a big driver for more ambition amongst EU's trading partners. I think at the national level, points to highlight are the UK post-Brexit will be having its own ETS, so the UK will be linking to the EU most likely. Also, the UK has already identified that its ambition needs to be more ambitious than the original Phase 4 cap setting. And the other interesting point is in Germany, there's likely to be a complementary ETS to the EU. This will include heating and transport fuels. Moving on to Asia Pacific, and firstly, ETS is under implementation. I'd like to focus and make some comments on the Korean emissions trading system, but without going into the detail, because Professor Yu will explain this in much more detail after my presentation. But I'd just like to say that the Korean emissions trading system is Korea's key policy for GHG mitigation. It's covering a significant proportion of total GHG emissions, and it's a very good reference and inspiration for other countries because it demonstrates that an emission trading system can work in an economy which is export focused and which is energy intensive. So I think the key things to look out for under the KETS will be the developments related to how the carbon cost might be passed through to electricity prices, potentially with an environmental dispatch option where the carbon cost can be reflected into the operating costs of coal and gas power stations and then influencing the merit order. And then as we hear that the Korea is signing up to net zero emissions by 2050 under the Korean Green New Deal, what does this mean to the KETS cap setting? And what role can the KETS play in Korea achieving the Green New Deal? In terms of more broadly across the Asia Pacific, I guess the key point is that there's a lot of ETSs under development. The most significant is in China. So China's national emissions trading system is expected to start real operation later this year, and it will automatically be the world's largest emissions trading system, even though it's only including its power sector. It will expand to include other industry sectors, and as I mentioned before, it will be based on a tradable performance standard approach. You can see that the countries that are actively working on emissions trading system are included developing countries in Southeast Asia, and there's a lot of progress been made in terms of the legal basis, in terms of the capacity building, in terms of the ETS design. Moving to America, so looking at the USA as an example, and obviously the biggest country, the most relevant examples of existing systems include the California cap and trade and the Ritchie program. So the California is a very good example of an effective emissions trading system. It also has a cap trajectory through to 2030 with a formula for the declining cap to 2050. The Ritchie system, I guess the interesting point that is it's expanding, more states are joining, and also the Transportation and Climate Initiative in the US is likely to be complementary to the Ritchie by including transport fuels. The most fundamental issue, I guess, is what's going to happen this year with the presidential election and potential Biden administration that would include a net zero target by 2050 and with milestone targets, and that will obviously have significant implications into any federal emissions trading system or carbon tax or whatever. I was asked about other developing countries in terms of perhaps countries in Africa and other countries in terms of, is an emissions trading system and a carbon market feasible? How can a country benefit from a carbon market? I would say from looking at these examples, particularly in Asia, that yes, an emissions trading system is feasible. I think it's important to adapt it to the national circumstances. It's important to focus on selected sectors and installations only, thinking of the 80-20 rule, so 80% of the emissions from 20% of the installations, carefully focusing on sectors that are most suited. It's important to protect industry from carbon leakage, for example, by 100% free allocation in the early phase, similar to Korea. And it's important to start data collection early. So in the Korean case, there was at least 3 years of high quality data collection and verification, and that's essential for a number of elements of ETS design. And then how can countries benefit from carbon markets? Well, most fundamentally, it gives them a way of achieving targets at lower cost, and it also provides the ability to facilitate transactions under the Paris Agreement. So just on my final slide, the key policy considerations and challenges for carbon markets to 2030. Number one is the ambition level. So more ambitious reductions are required by 2030, as we've seen in the case of the EU, for example, especially to reach net zero by 2050. There needs to be more rapid introduction, a more rapid establishment and strengthening of policies. Some countries have spent 30 years looking at carbon pricing. Some countries have spent 10 years thinking about the design. There's more experience now. Korea's done it very quickly by comparison, and I think there's more reference cases to learn from. So this can be done a lot more quickly. Cap setting needs to be done intelligently to create the right carbon price signal. It needs to reflect the reality of lower cost renewables. It needs to reflect coal phase out and other key economic drivers. In terms of sectoral issues, a major issue is about the power sector and how carbon pricing can be used to decarbonize the power sector. And I think a lesson can come from the Korean emissions trading system, particularly how the development of maybe environmental dispatch could enable putting the carbon price on coal power, and also scaling up auctioning, which is important to increase the cost of coal compared to lower carbon fuels. For the industry sector, the key challenge is to support industry in its investments for deep decarbonisation, as I mentioned. And then the other key issue is about the role of ETS. It's not suitable for all sectors, so some sectors might find ETS too burdensome for MRV or other practical factors. So carbon tax or some other policies in combination can be good. And then in terms of the design issues, finally, so definitely alignment with NDC carbon budgets is critical. Consistency with economic development and responsiveness to shocks. And then I think also the concept of linkage readiness, as Stefano mentioned about the Paris Agreement and the global carbon market. I think it's important for carbon pricing policies and emissions trading systems in particular to be linkage ready. So that means consistency in best practice for the key design elements. Also, it needs to be consistent in ambition level. And I was also asked about prospects for linking in East Asia. And more generally, I think that the reality of linking is that it requires a fairly mature ETS and it requires political will. So the reality at the moment is that the best ETSs for linking are the EU, New Zealand, Korea. The UK will be suitable when it's operating. So it's a relatively small number of jurisdictions, but the wider opportunity is when jurisdictions adopt a similar design. So as we saw in the Western Climate Initiative, Quebec, Ontario, and other countries, and other jurisdictions rather, adopted the design principles of California, and they could link much more quickly. So this is an opportunity for Korea to share its experience and encourage adoption of consistent design to enable perhaps a regional Asian carbon market. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention and listening. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ritchie, for your wonderful presentation, which showed us how international carbon markets might evolve under the Paris Agreement until 2030. I'm sure many of our audience must have found some insights for their plans for the next decade. Finally, let's move to the domestic carbon market with our last speaker, Professor Seung from Sookmyung Women's University, who will talk about the Korean emissions trading system, its past and its future. Professor, please. You have the stage for the next 20 minutes.
예, 안녕하세요.
Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank all the participants to the 11th IGC and also say that it's an honor to be presenting at this important conference. I will be talking about 5 main points today. First is Korea's GHG reduction targets. We have a 2020 target and we have a 2050 target, so I will talk about that. And then I will go on to the ETS system here in Korea, the market, the allowances market in Korea, and I will talk about the characteristics or features of the ETS in the country. And from 2021, we will be having the third phase of KETS. So what will be some institutional changes that will be applied? That is what I will talk about last. First of all, I'd like to talk about Korea's GHG's reduction targets and policies. As you know well, in 2009, we set and we announced our reduction target in 2010, and we've been revising it since. In 2015, we announced the 2030 target, so it'll be 851 tons in GHG emissions reduction. That's the target that we had set. In 2015, we did announce it, but then already from 2012, we already had a target management system in place. We had the RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard, in place already, and many other types of systems that were running. And in 2018, in line with what was happening globally, we maintained our target reduction at 37%. But our domestic reduction target was moved up from 25% to 32%. And so we will be utilizing either the international market or use domestic sinks in order to reach our targets. So that was announced back in 2018. So the emissions trading system was introduced in line with this plan that we had. And let me briefly talk about our KTS. The system itself began in 2015, but as Alistair has mentioned earlier in his presentation, in implementing the KTS, what was most important was to decide whether it'll be entity level or facility level, to have that data for the emissions. So from 2010, we already had the TMS in place, and we had the data for the emissions of the entities and the facilities back from 2007. We've been collecting that data already. So as we were securing more data, we already had the reporting system in place. Particularly, we had the third-party, independent party reporting system in place. So we had that data pool already. So from 2015 to 2017, we had the first phase. So we had an initial 3-year phase. and 525 entities participated in first phase. As I mentioned earlier, so the KETS began in 2015, but already we had a TMS, Target Management System, in place prior to that, which allowed us to secure good quality data. And so also in terms of expanding acceptability by the business, we began with free allocations. So based on past emissions, the grandfathering system, we gave out free allocations, thereby minimizing the burden to the companies. But for some entities, we applied the benchmarking system, which is a more improved criteria. But the free allocations, well, as the KTS proceeded, from 2021, 10% of the permits would be through the auctioning. That is stipulated in our law. So basically, the sectors involved in the KTS, well, ideally or theoretically, all sectors should be participating, but then we did have some criteria whereby we began with some sectors and industries. So for some companies, they did not have any emitting facilities. So in 2018, 2019, so in phase 2, we had 6 sectors included. And they continue to be a compliance entity until today. And as for the types of GHGs controlled, we have 7 GHGs being controlled. Well, globally 7, but in Korea we have 6 GHGs that we're controlling. And as for offsets, offset projects, well, we are running that international collaboration projects. Next, I'd like to show you the amount of reductions that we can have. 2 ways to see it. First is the direct emissions. So that is direct burning of carbon. That will be 70%. And then we also have indirect emissions. So for example, the use of electricity in buildings, in business activities. If indirect emissions would be included, then the emissions under ETS would take up 84% of the national emissions in Korea. So compared to other countries' ETS, the proportion that is included in the ETS is quite high. And if the permits are not submitted on time, there is penalty for the non-compliance. So that would be in US dollars about $90 per ton. So in the KTS, the emissions included in KTS versus or compared to the national emissions. So you will see both the direct case of both direct only or direct plus indirect emissions included. Now I'd like to talk about some features of the KETS. We have the cap setting system in place. So basically, from 2015, after we set our 2015 targets, in implementing our ETS, we wanted to have consistency with the national GHG reduction targets. So that was an important feature. But of course, in the initial phases, for the different sectors or industries, the reduction ratio was different. So there was this difference in the proportion or ratio of emissions reductions required of the different sectors, and we needed to harmonize that. And from 2018, phase 2 began, and rather than sectors, we broadened it to industry level in order to reflect the characteristics of the different industries. And also, Korea's ETS, another characteristic is that the indirect emissions is included in the allocations. So indirect emissions would be, well, for example, when you're using electricity, when you use electricity, there's emissions, but then in the process of producing electricity, then generating electricity, there would be emissions. So these indirect emissions were included in the ETS as well from phase 2. And the biggest reason for that is that the price of the permits, if it's 100% reflected in the electricity prices, that would be ideal. But in the case of Korea, our electricity prices are heavily regulated still. And so if there's a cost change, it cannot be 100% reflected in the electricity prices. And so we decided to include the indirect emissions as well. And basically, if you look at a certain point in time for the KETS, you may be given more allocations, you may have surplus, you may have shortage. And so we have a system of banking and borrowing that we are applying. And so within a single phase, you can borrow, but then in terms of banking, it's limited in between the different phases. So, of course, from the point of view of minimizing cost, there should be a more flexible banking and borrowing system in place, and that's what we are aiming for right now. And in terms of government allocations, some of the allocations are owned by the government, and we call that the reserves. We have the market stabilization reserves. We have the market maker reserves also for the new entrants, new entities that come into the system. We have the reserves for them as well. And the government already has this reserves system in place, which they operate. And what's also important is that compared to carbon tax, ETS has a benefit. Is that the prices can change in the market, so we do need to have some market stabilization measures in place if there is a heavy fluctuation in prices.
Next, let's talk about the allowances market in Korea. Well, as I have already mentioned before, the ETS market was introduced in 2015, so it's been in operation until 2020 thus far. We can see that thus far, on the average, it's been about 8,000 won per ton, but it actually grew to 29,000 won per ton. And then it actually grew to 40,000 won per ton very recently. But unlike the European cases, we have not seen high fluctuations. We have not seen any fluctuations that could not be tolerated within the market. So you could see that we have quite a stable increase in the price. But in the very beginning, we saw that the trade volume was quite limited, and now we see that the trade volume is also increasing. And then we can see the graph for the price movement from 2015 to April 30th of 2020. So we can see that the chart goes all the way to the time just before the impact of COVID-19. You can see that in September of 2018, we actually upgraded our goal, and so that is why I marked that there. So the price before and after is different, and you can see that overall it is a stable increase, a gradual increase towards the upper right corner. You can see that with the announcement of the upgrade of our goals in September of 2018, there is even a steeper increase in prices. I will go into this later on, but in Korea, because of COVID-19, since the end of March in 2020, we have been impacted. At that time, there was a sharp dip in the stock prices, but the dip was not as high for the ETS price in Korea. So overall, there's been an increase, and you can see that the increase is steeper since September 2018. As I mentioned before, the trade volume continues to increase. You can see that when we announced our second phase of September 2018, there was a spike, but you can see that it became quite stable after that. Let's take a look at the first ETS period from 2015 to 2017, whether we were able to achieve our goals. You can see that overall for the 3 years, the total allocation was about 1.6 billion tons, but the actual emissions was lower than that. More accurately, that goal was 1.6863 billion. The actual emission was 1.669 billion, so it was slightly lower than the total allocation, so our goal was achieved. You can see that there were some areas where there was excessive emissions, and in the power industry and the steel industry, we were not able to achieve our goals, and you can see that that is quite characteristics of the first phase. Here you can see that we started the second phase from 2018. Well, this is the latest report announced by the government, and you can see that in 2018, the winter was a bit colder than the average and hotter in the summer than the average, and so we can see that we emitted more than our allocation. So for that one specific year, we did have over emissions. Now let's take a look at the quantitative analysis of the price changes. What I would like to mention here is that overall, we see that the daily changes look quite independent, but what is notable is that when we announced the second phase in 2018, you can see that the past prices continue to impact the present prices. And so you can see there's a continuity in the KAU prices, unlike the time before September 2018. So you can see that the prices have become much more stable. And if we take a look at the monthly average prices, you can see that there are features that impact the prices. For example, power generation fuel costs such as LNG and coal, and you can see that the fuel spread actually impacts the QAU prices. Then let's take a look at the impact of COVID-19 on KETS while comparing that to the stock prices of Korea. In Korea, the financial market has had direct impacts by COVID-19, but in the ETS, we can see that the impact was not immediate, but rather when we go to May and June, a few months after the outbreak of COVID-19, you can see that the stock price market continues to recover, but the ETS starts to fall from that point on. And we believe that because COVID-19 is impacting the overall economy, this will continue to impact KETS until the year end. That is our forecast. Let's take a look at some suggestions for future revisions. Some have been announced by the government already. You can see that overall we are becoming more market friendly, and we can enable companies that are not mandated to participate to voluntarily participate, and we will be regulating the banking aspect, and we will also develop futures and derivative markets for carbon, and we will increase the share of allowances auctioned for perhaps to above 10%. As I mentioned before, if we could have infinite banking, then it could impact goals and the achievement of goals. So we will need deregulations. And we will also think about the inclusion of indirect emissions allocation with full pass-through on electricity prices. So this can happen only after the full pass-through on electricity prices. We need to make sure that the electricity prices absorb the pass-through so that we can have an indirect emissions allocation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for your very interesting presentation, which covered not only the dynamic development of the K-ETS market, but also the impact of COVID-19 on the K-ETS. This concludes the speaker session.